Get on the ground. Right now, Officer Kane Ryder said. You people really thought you could just… what? Have your little party? He laughed. One opportunity, Lieutenant. Please take your officers and leave my wedding, Cordelia Hayes said deliberately. Lady, I don't care who you think you are. He leaned in. You're nobody. You hear me? Get her in cuffs. The whole garden went silent. The guests watched an officer force a bride's arms behind her back, while her groom lay face down in the grass. What Officer Kane Ryder did not know was that he had just handcuffed a United States federal judge on her wedding day. The very woman who would decide his future. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because the next story is one you cannot miss. The mirror did not lie. Cordelia Hayes stood in the bridal suite of Magnolia Grove Estate and stared at the woman looking back at her. Ivory silk, pearl earrings, a veil so white it almost hurt to look at. She had stood in courtrooms for years without flinching. She had faced down defense attorneys, prosecutors, and men twice her age who thought a young black woman had no business holding a gavel. She had never once let them see her sweat. But right now, her hands were shaking. Hold still, Vivian said. Her sister's fingers worked carefully at the back of the veil, pinning it exactly right. Vivian Hayes was older than Cordelia, and she had been fixing things for Cordelia since their mother died. Shoelaces, broken friendships, a heart that needed mending after a divorce that nearly broke her. Today, it was a veil. Vivian treated it like the most important job she had ever done. Maybe it was. You're fidgeting, Vivian said, not looking up. I'm not fidgeting. Pero… Your left hand is shaking. Cordelia pressed her hand flat against her thigh. The silk was cool under her palm. She breathed in slowly, the way she always did before walking into a hard courtroom, and let it out even slower. From across the suite, the sound of laughter broke through her thoughts. Her bridesmaids, a federal prosecutor, a sitting congresswoman, and a woman who had clerked for the Supreme Court. Were passing around a champagne bottle and arguing about the music choices for the reception. 3 of the most powerful women Cordelia had ever known. And right now, they were bickering like teenagers at a slumber party. She loved them for it. She turned back to the mirror. For one quiet moment, she let herself just look. Not at the judge, not at the title, or the robe, or the years of rulings. Just the woman. Finally, completely, stupidly happy. Then the memory came. The way it always did when things got too good. She was a little girl. A Sunday morning. Her father had been wearing his best suit, dark blue, pressed sharp, and he had been walking with her down a sidewalk 2 blocks from their church. A police officer had stepped in front of them. Not because of anything her father did, not because of anything at all, except who her father was and what he looked like. Get off the sidewalk. Walk in the street where you belong. Her father had complied. He always complied. His jaw had tightened. She remembered that, the small muscle jumping near his ear. But he stepped off the curb without a word and took her hand and walked the rest of the way in the street like the officer told him to. That night, Cordelia had asked him why. He had sat on the edge of her bed for a long time before he answered. His voice had been soft and certain. Because today I can't win, baby. But one day you will. And he died before he got to see her sworn in. Hey! Vivian's hand came down on Cordelia's shoulder, gentle and firm at the same time. Don't you dare cry. I just did your makeup. Cordelia laughed. It came out a little watery, but it was real. I'm not crying. "Your eyes are lying," Vivian said, but she was smiling when she said it. She stepped around to face Cordelia and held her by both shoulders and looked at her the way only an older sister can, like she was seeing every version of her at once. The little girl, the law student surviving on coffee and determination, the young judge who walked into her first courtroom and refused to be small. "Mama would have loved this dress," Vivian said. Cordelia nodded. She did not trust her voice for a second. Outside, through the tall windows of the bridal suite, she could see the garden. Chairs arranged in perfect rows beneath Georgia magnolia trees. White roses on every aisle post, the afternoon light coming down warm and golden through the leaves. And at the far end of the aisle, at a wooden altar draped in white, stood Quentin Hale. Even from a distance, she could see his hands clasped in front of him. She could see him shift his weight just slightly, the way he always did when he was trying to hold himself together. She knew exactly how he felt. The string quartet began to play. "Ready?" Vivian asked. Cordelia looked at her father's face in her mind one last time. "One day, baby, you will." "Yeah," she said. "I'm ready." She stepped out of the suite and started walking. She was halfway to Quentin when the sirens hit. Not one, not two. 6 police cruisers tore up the venue's private drive like the place was on fire. Tires grinding the gravel, lights slashing red and blue across the white chairs, and the flower arrangements, and the faces of everyone who had come here to celebrate love. Cordelia stopped walking. For 1/2 second, nobody moved. The string quartet went silent mid-note. The flower girl, Quentin's niece, a little girl in a yellow dress, froze in the middle of the aisle with her basket clutched to her chest. Then the gates burst open. Officers in tactical gear poured into the garden with their hands on their weapons, and the world Cordelia had been standing in moments ago simply ceased to exist. "Nobody move. This is a lawful search. Stay where you are." The screaming started. Elderly guests lurched out of their chairs. A woman near the back fainted into her husband's arms. The flower girl dropped her basket and started crying. Petals scattering everywhere, and nobody picked them up because everyone was too busy trying to understand what was happening. Lieutenant Kane Ryder came through the gate last. He walked like a man who owned every room he entered. Pressed uniform, hard jaw, a search warrant held up in one hand like it was a trophy. He scanned the garden once, quick, dismissive, and then his voice cut across everything. "We have a credible report of illegal firearms and narcotics trafficking on this property. Everyone will remain calm and comply with all instructions. This is a wedding, Quentin." He had stepped away from the altar, both hands raised, his voice caught somewhere between outrage and pure disbelief. He was still wearing his boutonniere, a white gardenia, already starting to wilt in the Georgia heat. 2 officers moved on him immediately. "Sir, get on the ground." "I am not getting on the—" They did not wait for him to finish. They grabbed him by both arms and forced him down onto the grass, face first, in his tuxedo, in front of his family and his friends, and the woman he was supposed to marry in the next moments. Cordelia's breath left her body. The groomsmen were next. 4 black men in tuxedos ordered down into the grass with weapons trained on them like they were dangerous, like the pocket squares and the shined shoes, and the joy on their faces meant absolutely nothing. One of them, Quentin's college roommate, a man who taught middle school science, was shaking so hard his hands rattled against the ground. "Get your hands off me! I am a member of the United States Congress." That was Isolde Mercer, Congresswoman, Cordelia's bridesmaid, small and absolutely terrifying when angry. An officer grabbed her by the arm and turned her physically away from the scene. She did not stop talking. Nobody listened. Vivian came out of nowhere. She had followed Cordelia out of the suite, still holding the champagne glass, and when she saw Quentin on the ground and the officer's hand on Cordelia's arm, she moved like a woman years younger. "Get your hands off my sister." An officer stepped directly into her path with one hand out. The force of it sent Vivian stumbling backward. The champagne glass hit the ground and shattered. She grabbed at the officer's arm to keep her balance, and he shoved her back harder. And Cordelia watched her sister's elbow connect with one of the white chairs and heard her sharp cry of pain. Something cold and absolute settled into Cordelia's chest. Ryder was in front of her now. Up close, he was younger than she expected. Sandy-haired, with the particular kind of smirk that some men get when they feel completely untouchable. He looked her up and down. The gown, the veil, the pearl earrings. And his expression did not change even slightly. She was not a person to him. She was an inconvenience in a white dress. "Ma'am, I need you on the ground." Cordelia did not move. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She looked at Kane Ryder with eyes that had stared down career criminals and corrupt attorneys and men who thought they could intimidate her into smaller decisions. And she said, very quietly and very clearly, "Lieutenant, I need you to think very carefully about what you do next." Ryder looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he smiled. "Lady," he said, "I don't care if you're the Queen of England. Get down." Ryder did not even blink. "Last warning," he said. "On the ground, or you're in cuffs. Your choice." Cordelia stood in her ivory gown, with her hands at her sides, and looked at him like he was a problem she had already solved. Around them, the garden had become something unrecognizable. Guests were pressed together in frightened clusters. An older man in a gray suit was trying to help his wife stay calm while she wept into his shoulder. The groomsmen were still face down on the grass. Quentin had not moved from where they had forced him down. He kept trying to turn his head to find Cordelia, and every time he did, an officer barked at him to stay still. Nobody was looking at Ryder's junior officer. His name was Tyler Watts, young, new on the job. He had been standing near the garden gate trying to look useful, and for the first few minutes, he had managed it. Kept his face neutral, kept his hand near his belt, acted like he knew exactly why officers had just destroyed a wedding on a Saturday afternoon in Atlanta. But then he had recognized Isolde Mercer. He had seen her on the news enough times to know her face. Congresswoman, House Judiciary Committee, and she was not the only one. The woman next to her, the one who had been a bridesmaid, Tyler had seen her picture in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution recently. Federal prosecutor. The woman beside her had argued before the Supreme Court. Tyler looked around the garden slowly, really looked. These were not ordinary guests. He moved quietly, pulled out his phone, typed fast, thumbs stumbling a little. Searched the name he had heard an officer read off the warrant paperwork when they were briefing earlier. Quentin Hale, Associated Party, Cordelia Hayes. He hit search. The result came up quickly. The photo was professional, official. A black woman in judicial robes seated behind a bench, her expression calm and precise, and completely certain of itself. The caption below read, "The Honorable Cordelia Hayes, U.S. Federal District Court Judge, Eastern District of Georgia, appointed years earlier, reconfirmed later." Tyler looked at the photo. Then he looked at the woman in the wedding dress feet away. Same cheekbones, same eyes, same absolute stillness in the face of pressure. His stomach dropped straight through the ground. He crossed the garden in a few steps and grabbed Ryder by the sleeve. "Lieutenant?" His voice came out lower than he intended. "Sir, I need you to see something." Ryder turned with the expression of a man who did not enjoy being interrupted. Tyler held out the phone anyway. Ryder looked at the screen. The garden seemed to get quieter, though nothing had actually changed. Ryder's jaw stopped moving. The smirk, the permanent, untouchable smirk, flickered. Just for a second. Just enough to show that something underneath it was not as solid as it looked. He looked at Cordelia. He looked at the phone. He looked at Cordelia again. Around them, officers were starting to notice. The body language shift moved through the group the way a cold wind moves through tall grass. One, then the next, then the next. Someone holstered their weapon. Someone else took a quiet step back. Cordelia had watched all of it. Every second. She had not moved a muscle, but her eyes had tracked Ryder's face with the patience of someone who had waited out much harder moments than this one. Now, she tilted her head, just a degree, and when she spoke, her voice was so calm, it was almost gentle. "I'm going to give you one opportunity," she said. "Stand down this operation. Release every person on this property. Take your officers and leave my wedding." She paused. "One opportunity, Lieutenant. I'd take it." The whole garden was watching now. Even the crying had stopped. Even the elderly man with his arm around his wife had gone still. Everyone held their breath. Ryder stood there for a long moment with the phone in his hand, and the truth of what he had walked into laid out right in front of him. He handed the phone back to Tyler. He straightened his uniform, and then Lieutenant Ryder made the worst decision of his life. "The warrant is legal," he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The search proceeds." He looked directly at Cordelia. "Cuff her." The phones came out across the entire garden. Every guest, all at once. Every camera aimed and recording. Officers had stopped trying to take them. There were simply too many. Nobody was going to unsee this. Cordelia said nothing as they pulled her arms behind her back. She said nothing as the cuffs clicked into place. She said nothing as Ryder walked her toward the police vehicle, her veil tilted sideways, her gown dragging across the trampled grass. She did not need to say anything. The witnesses were saying it for her. The door closed. Cordelia sat in the back of the police cruiser and listened to it click shut. And then there was nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the muffled chaos outside the window. Through the glass, she could see the garden, the overturned chairs, the officers moving through the rows of guests like they owned the place. Vivian, standing at the perimeter with her arms crossed and tears running down her face. Not the soft kind of tears, the furious kind. Quentin was in a separate vehicle. She could not see him from here. She closed her eyes. Most people in handcuffs in the back of a police car on their wedding day, in a dress that cost more than their first car. Most people would fall apart. Cordelia understood that. She had sat on the bench long enough to know exactly what fear and helplessness felt like when they hit a person at the same time. But Cordelia Hayes had a rule she had followed since her first year on the bench. When everything is on fire, think. So she thought. She thought about the warrant, thought about the timestamp her brother had spotted, approved far too quickly. She thought about Ryder's face when he looked at that phone screen, and the half-second of panic before the arrogance slammed back down like a steel door. She thought about the camera phones, all of them recording, all uploading to places Kane Ryder could not touch. She opened her eyes. "Excuse me," she said. The officer in the front seat glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Young. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'd like to make one phone call," Cordelia said. "You're not required to allow it, but I'm asking." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away. Then he reached forward, unlocked his personal cell phone, and held it toward her. "What's the number?" he said quietly. She gave it to him. He dialed, then held the phone up to her ear, and kept it there without being asked. It rang once. "O'Hara," Ilara Quinn's voice was exactly what Cordelia needed to hear. Calm and sharp at the same time, like a blade wrapped in good manners. Cordelia had hired her as a law clerk years ago and watched her become one of the most capable federal officers she had ever known. "Ilara," Cordelia said. "They raided the wedding. Fake tip. Quentin is in custody. I'm in a vehicle on the property now." 1 second of silence. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Is Quentin hurt?" "I don't believe so." "Who authorized the warrant?" "I don't know yet. It was expedited far too quickly." Another silence, shorter this time. "I'm already moving," Ilara said. The call lasted only moments. The officer lowered the phone. He did not look at her. He set it back on the front seat and stared straight ahead through the windshield. And Cordelia noticed that his hands were gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary for a vehicle that was not moving. She settled back against the seat and turned her face to the window and let herself have exactly a few seconds of something that was not anger, and was not grief, and was not fear. It was just the weight of the day pressing down on her all at once. The flowers, the quartet, Quentin at the altar with his eyes full of everything he wanted to say. A few seconds. Then she put it away. Outside at the far edge of the property, her brother was already working. Silas Kane had been a cop for years before he quit and opened the nonprofit. He still thought like one. When the officers had swept through the garden collecting people, Silas had done the thing he learned early on the force. Stay calm. Speak clearly. Identify yourself before they have a reason to decide for you. He had his old badge in his wallet out of habit. He showed it, gave his name, stated his connection to the property. The officer waved him to the perimeter and moved on to someone easier to deal with. Silas had been standing at that perimeter ever since, watching everything. He had a good eye. Always had. And what his eye had caught during the moments Ryder was waving the warrant paperwork around before the search began was the filing timestamp on the top right corner of the document. Far too quick start to finish. That was not procedure. That was pull. Someone inside that department had pushed this warrant through so fast the ink was barely dry, and that meant someone inside that department had something to gain from it. Silas got on his phone. He worked through several contacts before he reached the right one. A retired desk sergeant named Alonzo, who had decades of institutional memory and no particular loyalty to people who did dirty work. Alonzo called back quickly. The text was short. Just a company name and a person. The shell company's registered agent, Harlan Voss. Silas stared at the screen. He knew that name. Everyone in Atlanta knew that name. Old money. Real estate. Multiple times, Cordelia had ruled against Voss's development projects from the bench. Multiple times, Voss had walked out of her courtroom looking like a man who did not forget things. Silas looked up from the phone, looked at the cruiser holding his sister. His jaw tightened the same way their fathers had, all those years ago on a Sunday sidewalk. He started making another call. They left without saying a word. No explanation, no apology. Not even the basic decency of eye contact. The officers filed back through the garden gate the same way they came in. Except this time, their weapons were holstered, and their warrant had produced absolutely nothing, because there was nothing to find. Ryder was the last one out. He walked past Cordelia like she was a lamppost, like she was nothing, like the last hours had been a minor inconvenience he was already forgetting. The gate swung shut behind him. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Quentin crossed the garden in long strides and pulled Cordelia into his arms, and she let him. And the two of them stood in the middle of what was supposed to be the best day of their lives and held on to each other while the wreckage settled around them. It was bad. The white chairs were scattered and overturned across the grass. The flower arrangements had been knocked from their posts, petals ground into the dirt under boot heels. The reception table near the garden wall had been upended during the search. Dishes shattered, glasses broken. The 3-tier wedding cake destroyed completely, lying in pieces across the flagstone like something that had fallen from a great height. 2 elderly guests, a couple who had driven hours from Savannah, were being attended to by a paramedic near the gate. The woman had gone faint during the commotion. Her husband had not let go of her hand since. Vivienne stood near the altar with her arms wrapped around herself. There was a bruise already forming on her forearm, dark against her skin, where the officer had shoved her into the chair. She was staring at the destroyed cake like she was deciding something. "You okay?" Cordelia asked her. Vivienne looked up. Her eyes were dry now, past the crying stage and into something colder. "No," she said simply. "Are you?" Cordelia looked around the garden. Years on the federal bench, years of building something from nothing, of fighting for every inch, of refusing to be made small. And they had walked in here on her wedding day, her one day, and done this. "Not even a little," Cordelia said. By evening, the footage was everywhere. Cordelia watched it from the couch at home, still in her wedding dress, because she had not been able to make herself change yet. Her phone had been ringing for hours, and she had stopped answering it a while ago. On the television, the clip played on a loop. Cordelia in ivory silk, hands cuffed behind her back, being walked across a trampled garden while dozens of camera phones tracked every step. Cable networks had picked it up quickly. By dinner time, it had millions of views. Quentin sat beside her. Silas sat across from them. Vivienne had made coffee that nobody was drinking. Then the press conference started. Chief Victor Langford filled the screen. Silver-haired, built like a man who had spent decades making himself look trustworthy. He stood behind a podium with 3 flags behind him, and the kind of expression that said he had already decided how this was going to go. He called the raid procedurally sound. He said the tip had been credible and serious. He said his officers had acted with professionalism and restraint. And then he looked directly into the camera and said, "No one in this city is above the law. Not even federal judges." The room went absolutely silent. Vivienne set down her coffee cup very carefully, like she did not trust what she might do if she was holding something. Cordelia did not react. She just watched Langford's face on the screen, the practiced sincerity of it, the complete absence of shame. And then she reached over and turned the television off. "Silas," she said, "show them." Silas pulled out his phone and laid everything out on the coffee table. The warrant timestamp, Alonzo's text, the shell company registration, Harlan Voss's name at the bottom of all of it. He walked them through the connection between Voss's real estate network and the corridor where Magnolia Grove Estates sat. Acres that Voss had been circling for years. Quentin leaned forward, reading. His expression moved through disbelief and into something harder. Vivienne just stared at the name. Harlan Voss. Cordelia stood up from the couch. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark street for a long moment. When she turned around, something had changed in her face. The grief was gone. The shock was gone. What was left was something focused and immovable, like a door being locked from the inside. "I've spent years giving everyone their day in court," she said quietly. Nobody spoke. "I think it's time I took mine." The next morning came gray and quiet. Cordelia was already at the kitchen table when Quentin came downstairs. She had not slept much. He could tell by the way she was sitting, perfectly straight, both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, eyes fixed on something that was not in the room. There was a legal pad on the table in front of her. She had filled several pages. Silas arrived early. Vivian came a little later, still moving carefully because of the bruise on her forearm. They sat around the table, and Cordelia looked at each of them in turn, the way she did in court, when she was about to say something that needed to land cleanly. "I'm filing for personal leave from the bench," she said. "Effective today, I'm recusing myself from all active cases." The silence was immediate. Quentin set down his mug. Vivian opened her mouth and then closed it. Silas leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, the way he did when he was running numbers in his head. "Cordelia," Vivian started. "Let me finish." Cordelia's voice was calm, not cold. Calm. There was a difference, and her family knew it. "I'm going to file a civil rights lawsuit against Kane Ryder, Victor Langford, and every party connected to what happened. To do that properly, I need to be a plaintiff. And a sitting federal judge cannot be a plaintiff in a case that touches her jurisdiction." She paused. "So I'm stepping down temporarily. I'm taking off the robe, and I'm fighting this as a private citizen." Another silence, longer this time. "They would love that," Silas said carefully. "Langford and Voss, you giving up your seat?" "I'm not giving it up. I'm setting it down." Cordelia looked at him steadily. "There's a difference. And here's the other thing. If I fight this from behind the bench, I'm protected, institutionally safe. Nobody can touch me. But I'm also limited. I can't be the face of this. I can't stand up in a courtroom and say what happened to us and what it means." She shook her head. "I didn't spend years on that bench to hide behind it the first time someone comes for me personally." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, like a man conceding a point he had already known he was going to lose. Quentin reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Vivian picked up her coffee. "Who's the attorney?" "Julian Croft," Cordelia said. Vivian raised her eyebrows. Even she knew that name. Julian Croft had an office on Peachtree Street that looked exactly like a man who had been winning impossible cases for decades. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk the size of a small country, framed rulings on the wall. Not his degrees, his rulings. The cases he had argued and won mounted like paintings. He was older, medium height, with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of stillness that came from never having anything left to prove. When Cordelia and Silas walked in and sat across from him, he did not offer pleasantries. He just looked at Cordelia with sharp, patient eyes and waited. She laid it all out. The raid, the warrant, the timestamp, Voss's name on the shell company, the other incidents Silas's team had begun tracing. All of it, clean and precise, the way she would present to a court. Croft listened without interrupting once. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Croft looked down at the notes he had been making and tapped his pen against the pad twice. "You understand what you're doing," he said. It was not a question. "I do. You're stepping off the highest ground you have, voluntarily, to fight on open terrain." "Yes," he studied her. "Most people in your position would work the phones quietly, call in favors, let the institution handle it from the inside." "The institution didn't stop it from happening," Cordelia said. "I don't see why I should trust it to fix it." Croft was quiet for another moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, exactly, but the closest thing to one she had seen from him yet. "I've been waiting years," he said, "for a client who actually understands what she's up against." Cordelia looked at him evenly across the wide desk. "Then let's not waste any more time." Croft clicked his pen and turned to a fresh page. After some time, the walls started going up. It began with the security footage. Croft called Cordelia one morning after she and Quentin had signed the retainer. His voice had that particular flatness it got when he was delivering bad news he had already processed so he could hand it to you clean. "The security server at Magnolia Grove is gone," he said. Wiped. Whoever did it knew exactly where to look and exactly how to do it. The venue owners noticed it when their own IT contractor went in to pull the files for us. Cordelia was quiet for a moment. Langford's office? They deny any knowledge. Naturally. Croft paused. It gets worse. It did? The Atlanta Police Department's warrant processing unit had conducted an internal audit, conveniently, in the days since Cordelia filed her initial complaint. The result of that audit was that all records related to the expedited approval of the Magnolia Grove warrant had been removed from the filing system. Not misfiled, not archived, removed. The officer who handled the processing was on administrative leave for unrelated reasons and unavailable for comment. Cordelia sat with the phone against her ear and said nothing for a few full seconds. "They're cleaning house," she said. "Fast," Croft agreed. "Which means they're scared. Scared people make mistakes. We just have to be patient enough to find them." Patient. Cordelia wrote the word on her legal pad and underlined it twice, the way she did with things she needed to remember, to feel rather than just know. By later that week, Voss's attorneys had filed 2 separate injunctions. The first blocked Alara Quinn's federal investigation from accessing the shell company's financial records, citing privacy protections for private business entities. The second challenged the federal jurisdiction of the investigation entirely, arguing that a local police action did not constitute a federal civil rights matter. Both injunctions were well constructed. Both would take time to defeat. Alara called Cordelia that evening from what sounded like a parking garage. Her voice was tight, but controlled. "They've got good lawyers," Alara said. "Voss can afford good lawyers," Cordelia said. "Can we beat them?" "Yes, but not quickly." Cordelia looked at the legal pad on her kitchen table. The pages were filling up fast now. Names, dates, connections, every thread she and Croft and Silas were pulling at simultaneously. It looked like progress. It also looked like a net with holes in it. "Keep moving," Cordelia said. Later brought the cruelest blow of the week. 2 employees of Magnolia Grove Estate had agreed to give statements. Both had been present during the raid. Both had heard Lieutenant Ryder, in the minutes before he spotted Cordelia make a remark to a fellow officer about his exact words, as both had reported them independently. These people and their parties. It was small, but in a civil rights case, small things mattered. Small things were often the difference. Croft called Cordelia that afternoon. Both witnesses had recanted. No explanation. No new information. They had simply contacted Croft's office and withdrawn their statements. One of them had done it through an attorney, a brand new attorney retained that same week, whose office address was 2 floors below Voss's real estate company in a building on Marietta Street. Cordelia did not say anything when Croft told her. She just wrote both names on her legal pad and circled them. The weekend brought the television. Vivian had come over with groceries, and the particular energy of a woman who needed to keep her hands busy so she would not say everything on her mind. She was making rice and chicken in Cordelia's kitchen when Quentin turned on the news, and they all went quiet at the same time. Kane Ryder was on cable television in a pressed civilian shirt, sitting across from a sympathetic anchor who was nodding along like he was describing a natural disaster he had heroically survived. Ryder's voice was measured, reasonable. He looked directly into the camera and said that every procedure had been followed correctly, that the tip had been credible, that his officers had acted with complete professionalism, and that it was a shame a routine search was being turned into, his words, a political weapon by someone with enough connections to make the whole country look the wrong way. The anchor nodded again. Vivian turned from the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand. "He is unbelievable. Vivian." Cordelia's voice was quiet. "Don't Vivian me. That man is sitting on national television lying through every single tooth in his Vivian." When Vivian stopped, she looked at Cordelia. Cordelia was watching Ryder's face on the screen with an expression that was completely, almost unnervingly, calm. "He believes he's untouchable," Cordelia said. She picked up her pen. "That's always the first mistake." After more time, Silas walked into Croft's office carrying a folder inches thick. He set it on the conference table without a word. Then he sat down across from Cordelia and Croft and looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had spent recent days hoping he was wrong about something and had just run out of hope. "It's not just us," he said. Croft pulled the folder toward him and opened it. Cordelia leaned in from the other side. For the next stretch of time, the only sounds in the room were turning pages and the distant noise of Peachtree Street far below. The first case was a restaurant. Silas's team had found it early in their research. A Black-owned soul food restaurant called Lena's Table on the southwest side of Atlanta. Some time ago, it had been raided by the Atlanta Department of Health and the police department simultaneously, responding to an anonymous tip alleging multiple code violations and unsanitary food handling. The raid happened on a busy afternoon during the lunch rush. Officers cleared the dining room. Health inspectors went through the kitchen. They found nothing. No violations. No evidence of anything the tip described. Weeks later, Lena's Table received a notice from its landlord, citing the raid as a breach of conduct under their lease agreement. The restaurant lost the lease. The building was purchased by a property management company months after that. That company was a subsidiary of a larger real estate holding group. That holding group traced back to Harlan Voss. Silas turned to the next tab in the folder without being asked. A church. Greater Emmanuel Baptist on the west side. Months earlier, officers had entered the church parking lot on a Sunday morning between the end of the early service and the start of the late one, so both congregations were present, responding to an anonymous tip about illegal weapons being stored on the property. They searched the parking lot, the groundskeeper's shed, and the church van. They found nothing. An elderly deacon had a heart episode during the search and was taken to the hospital. The church's application for an expansion permit, filed earlier, was denied weeks after the raid, citing unresolved community concerns about the property. Greater Emmanuel had been trying to build a community center on the adjacent lot for years. That adjacent lot was currently listed as pending acquisition by a Voss development subsidiary. Cordelia set down the page she was holding. "Keep going," she said. Silas kept going. Several more. A Black-owned dry cleaning business whose owner had been handcuffed in front of his customers during a search that produced nothing, and whose commercial lease had tripled in price weeks later. A family-owned hardware store. A community health clinic operating out of a building that a Voss LLC had been trying to purchase for months without success, until an anonymous tip brought officers through the front door on a weekday afternoon. And the clinic's operating license came under sudden regulatory review. Multiple incidents over recent months. Every single one of them triggered by an anonymous tip. Every tip traced through a shell company. Every shell company structured identically. Same filing format, same registered agent categories, same deliberately obscured ownership layers. And every targeted property sitting inside a development corridor that Harlan Voss had been quietly, methodically, buying up piece by piece. Cordelia stood up from the table and walked to the window. Below her, Atlanta moved in its ordinary afternoon rhythm. Cars and people and the whole indifferent machinery of the city going about its business. Somewhere in that city, Harlan Voss was in an office or a country club or a boardroom, and he believed that all of this was buried, that families had been hurt and scared and driven out, and that nobody had connected the lines between them. He had not counted on Silas. She turned back to the table. Croft had not looked up from the folder. He was still reading slowly and methodically, moving from tab to tab with the focus of a man cataloging ammunition. His pen was moving. His expression was unreadable. Finally, he closed the folder. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up at Cordelia, with something in his eyes she had not seen there before. Not just focus, something closer to awe. "Cordelia," he said carefully, "do you know what you have here?" She held his gaze. "A federal civil rights conspiracy," she said. Croft looked back down at the folder. He placed both hands flat on top of it, like he was keeping it from going somewhere. "We file everything," he said. "Every word, every family, every name." He reached for his pen. "All of them." Weeks after walking into Croft's office, Cordelia walked into federal court. She wore steel gray. No jewelry except her pearl earrings, the same ones she had worn at the wedding. Quentin had noticed when she put them in that morning and had not said anything, just watched her with that steady, careful look of his. She had caught his eye in the mirror and nodded once, and he had nodded back. And that was enough. Outside the Richard B. Russell Federal Building, cable news trucks were parked along the curb. A small crowd had gathered on the steps. Some supporters, some protesters, some people who had simply read the news and wanted to see what justice looked like when it finally showed up to work. Silas walked on Cordelia's left. Croft walked on her right. Vivian had wanted to come. Cordelia had asked her to stay home and watch with Quentin. Some things you needed witnesses for. Others you needed to walk into alone. The courtroom filled fast. Journalists took the back rows. In the gallery, Cordelia recognized staffers from the House Judiciary Committee sitting quietly with notepads. Ilara Quinn, sat several rows behind the plaintiff's table in civilian clothes. Her federal marshal's composure locked down completely. Across the aisle, Voss's legal team was already arranged. Several attorneys in expensive suits with a wall of bankers' boxes stacked beside them, like a fortress they believed in. Voss himself was not present. His lawyers had advised against it, Cordelia assumed. Langford was not there either. Ryder was. He sat in the gallery in a dark suit with his arms crossed and his jaw set. And when Cordelia walked past him to reach the plaintiff's table, he stared at her with the particular contempt of a man who still believed he was going to win. She did not look at him. The Honorable Naomi Ellis took the bench right on time. Sharp-faced, with a reputation for asking the questions nobody wanted to answer. She had been on the federal bench for years and had never once been accused of being predictable. Croft rose and began. He was extraordinary. Cordelia had known he would be. She had seen his record, read his rulings, heard the stories. But watching him work in person was something else entirely. He laid out the civil rights conspiracy case with the patience and precision of a master craftsman. He did not rush. He did not perform. He simply built, piece by piece, the complete architecture of what Harlan Voss and Victor Langford had constructed. The fake tips, the shell companies, the raids, the families, the property acquisitions, until the courtroom could see it whole. Judge Ellis listened without expression. But she asked questions. Sharp ones. She asked Voss's lead attorney to explain the timeline of the expedited warrant approval with a specificity that made the man visibly uncomfortable. She asked about the structural similarities between the shell companies with the focus of someone who had already noticed them herself. When Croft presented Alara's federal findings tracing companies directly, Ellis looked at the documents for a long time before setting them down. Voss's attorneys objected repeatedly. Ellis sustained some, overruled others, and at one point looked at their lead counsel over her glasses and said, "Counselor, I've read your brief. I'd like you to answer my question." The gallery was very quiet after that. By midday, it was over. Judge Ellis gathered her notes and looked out at the courtroom. She would issue her ruling on advancing to full trial within a short time. She said nothing else that could be quoted or analyzed or spun, but her eyes had said enough. In the corridor afterward, Croft allowed himself exactly one satisfied exhale. Silas was grinning so wide, it looked like it might be permanent. Alara Quinn crossed the corridor and shook Cordelia's hand without a word, which from Alara was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Quentin was on the phone the second Cordelia walked through the door that evening. He made her sit down. He made her eat. And then they went out to the back porch, the way they always did when they needed the quiet, and sat side by side in the dark, with the Georgia night making its usual sounds around them. Cordelia leaned her head on his shoulder. "After a while," he said, "after all this is done, we're having the most beautiful wedding this city has ever seen." She laughed, not a polite laugh, not the careful, composed laugh of a federal judge managing a public moment. A full, open, completely unguarded laugh that came from somewhere deep and real, the first one since the raid. Quentin pulled her closer. For the first time in weeks, Cordelia Hayes let herself believe it was almost over. The call came early in the morning. Cordelia was still in her robe, both hands around her coffee mug, watching the light come up over the backyard. She had slept better than she had in weeks. For the first time since the raid, she had gone to bed without her legal pad, without her pen, without the low-grade hum of dread that had been running underneath everything like a broken appliance she had gotten used to hearing. She should have known better. The judge recused herself, Croft said. Cordelia set down her mug. Overnight, Croft continued, Voss's team filed a conflict of interest motion late. They argued that Judge Ellis's collegial relationship with you through the federal judiciary constitutes an appearance of bias. The motion is thin. Technically, it shouldn't have cleared, but it did. He paused. She had no choice but to step down. Cordelia stood up slowly from the kitchen table. "Who's the replacement?" The silence on the other end lasted exactly a second too long. "Reginald Crowe," Croft said. She knew the name. Every federal attorney in Georgia knew the name. Reginald Crowe was older, appointed to the federal bench by a governor years ago. That governor had received the single largest private donation of his entire political career from a PAC with Harlan Voss's fingerprints all over it. Croft was still talking. Cordelia was listening, but part of her mind was already running the math. The angles, the exposure. Crowe moved within the hour. He dismissed several of the primary counts on a standing technicality, ruling that some of the plaintiffs among the victims lacked sufficient documented connection to the original complaint to maintain their claims at this stage. He ruled some of Silas's shell company research submissions entirely inadmissible on the grounds that evidence gathered through a non-profit advocacy organization did not meet federal evidentiary standards. And he set the new hearing date weeks out. Cordelia was in Croft's office early. She sat in the chair across from his desk and listened to him explain each ruling in precise, measured terms. He was angry. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his pen kept clicking. But he kept his voice level, because that was who Julian Croft was. He did not waste energy on reactions he could not use. "We appeal the evidentiary rulings," he said. "We redocument the shell company research through official channels. It takes time, but we rebuild." "Weeks," Cordelia said. "Weeks," Croft confirmed. She nodded. She stood up. She thanked him and walked out. The story ran that afternoon. Someone in Langford's camp had been sitting on it waiting for the right moment. The headline appeared on a major news outlet's website. Federal judge's wedding venue had prior noise complaints. Was tip entirely baseless? The piece was thin and carefully worded. Nothing technically false. Everything deliberately misleading. It cited anonymous sources and a noise complaint filed against the venue months earlier that had been resolved in a single mediation meeting. By later, it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. By evening, cable programs were running segments debating whether the original tip had contained a kernel of legitimate concern. The wedding footage, the video that had moved millions of people, the video of Cordelia in her ivory gown, being handcuffed on the most important day of her life, was suddenly buried under an avalanche of noise. Cordelia watched it happen from her living room and said nothing. Then Quentin's phone rang. He stepped into the kitchen to take it. Cordelia heard his voice change. That particular shift from normal to careful that meant something was wrong. He came back to the doorway and stood there with the phone in his hand and an expression she had never seen on him before. Something stripped down, exposed. "The medical board," he said. "I've received notice of an inquiry filed anonymously." He looked at her. "They're coming after my practice, Cordelia." The room went very still. Quentin sat down at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands. This man, this steady, gentle, unshakable man, sat there with his shoulders curved inward and said quietly, "I love you more than anything in this world, but I need you to tell me, is this going to stop?" Cordelia stood at the kitchen window. Outside, the street was dark and ordinary. Somewhere out there, Harlan Voss was sleeping just fine. She stared at the dark for a long time. "Yes," she said finally. She turned around. "But not the way they think." Quentin went to bed later. Cordelia heard the creak of the stairs, then the sound of water running through the pipes above her. Then, silence. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the legal pad in front of her for a long time without writing anything. The house was completely quiet, except for the refrigerator hum and the occasional car passing outside. She thought about her father, not the memory she usually carried. The sidewalk, the Sunday suit, the police officer's voice. A different one. She was a girl, and she had come home from school with a split lip because a girl twice her size had decided Cordelia's straight-A report card was a personal offense. Her father had sat across from her at this same kind of kitchen table. Different house, same feeling. And cleaned the cut with a damp cloth and said, "Did you fight back?" She had shaken her head. Cordelia picked up her pen. She wrote 3 names on the legal pad, drew a line under each one. Then she picked up her phone and made the first call. The DOJ Civil Rights Division operates out of Washington, but the senior field official for the Southeast region kept late hours. Cordelia knew this because she had served alongside him on a federal judicial panel years ago and learned that Roger Castillo was the kind of man who answered his phone late without acting like it was unusual. He answered on the second ring. Cordelia did not ask for favors. She did not call in history or relationship or any of the quiet currency that moved through institutional networks. She spoke the way she always spoke in a courtroom, clearly, precisely, without decoration. She laid out the documented pattern, the incidents, the shell companies, the property corridors, the connections between Voss's financial network and the Atlanta Police Department's warrant processing unit. She cited dates, filing numbers, and the specific federal statutes she believed had been violated. She was not a plaintiff calling for help. She was a federal officer of the court reporting a documented conspiracy. Those were two completely different things, and Roger Castillo understood the difference immediately. "I'll need everything you have in writing," he said. "By morning. You'll have it by midnight," Cordelia said. She hung up and started writing. The second call went to the editor of a national investigative journalism outlet whose work Cordelia had admired for years. She did not provide evidence. She was careful about that. Meticulous. The way she was about everything. What she provided was a roadmap, a series of questions whose answers, if pursued by a reporter with the right access and the right determination, would lead somewhere significant. The editor listened without interrupting. When Cordelia finished, the editor said, "How long have you been sitting on this?" "I've been building it," Cordelia said. "There's a difference. How long do I have?" "However long it takes to do it right." "A couple of weeks," the editor said. "Maybe less." Cordelia wrote the timeline on her legal pad and circled it. The third call was the quietest. She dialed Judge Reginald Crowe late. He answered after several rings, his voice thick with sleep, and then suddenly alert when he heard who was calling. Cordelia could picture him sitting up in the dark, reaching for a lamp. She was not hostile. She was not threatening. She was, if anything, impeccably courteous. The way you were courteous with a colleague when you needed them to understand something clearly and completely. She informed him that she had filed a formal complaint that afternoon with the Federal Judicial Council. The complaint documented the timeline of his rulings in her case, alongside the public financial records connecting the governor's PAC, the one funded significantly by Voss's network, to Crowe's original appointment. She was not accusing him of anything, she said. She was simply noting that the complaint was now a matter of official record. "I thought you'd want to know before it became public," she said. Professional courtesy. Crowe said nothing for a long moment. "Good night, Judge," Cordelia said. She hung up. She sat back in her chair and looked at the legal pad. 3 names, 3 lines. She drew a check beside each one, closed the pad, and turned off the kitchen light. Croft called early the next morning. Cordelia was already dressed, already at the table. Coffee made, legal pad open, pen in hand. "Crowe recused himself," Croft said. His voice carried something it had not held in weeks, a current of energy running just beneath the surface, controlled but unmistakable. Cordelia exhaled slowly through her nose. "Good," she said. "Cordelia." Croft paused. "What did you do last night?" She looked out the kitchen window at the morning coming up pale and clean over the backyard. "I fought smart," she said. "The subpoenas landed midweek, not one at a time, not quietly through the mail with the polite fiction that everyone involved had time to prepare. They arrived simultaneously. Ilara Quinn's team had coordinated the delivery with the kind of precision that only federal resources could produce. Hitting Langford's department, Voss's financial records office, the registered agents for all the shell companies, and the Atlanta Police Department's warrant processing unit within a short window. By mid-morning, several attorneys had called Julian Croft's office to complain. Croft did not return a single one of those calls. Ilara ran the operation from a federal field office on the north side of Atlanta. Cordelia had spoken to her briefly the night before, a short call, efficient and focused, and Ilara had said only what she needed to say. "We have everything we need to move. Give me a few days." She had not needed a few days. Her team had been building quietly for weeks, working the financial architecture of Voss's shell company network, with the patience of people who understood that the goal was not to find something. It was to find everything, every transfer, every filing, every corporate layer carefully constructed to put distance between Harlan Voss's name and the damage his money caused. What broke the case open was not a document. It was a phone. One of Voss's deputies, a man named Gabby Pruitt, who had worked as his operations manager for years, had made the mistake that careful people always eventually make. He had used his personal phone for 2 conversations he should have made disappear. The messages had been deleted. Ilara's digital forensics team recovered them anyway, the way federal digital forensics teams always did, pulling the data back from the spaces where deleted things went to hide. The first message was from Pruitt to a senior officer in Langford's warrant processing unit. It was sent days before the Magnolia Grove raid. It read, "The Hayes situation needs to be addressed before she comes back from leave and starts making noise about the corridor properties. Langford knows what to do. Make sure the paperwork moves fast." The second message was the reply. 3 words. "Consider it done." Ilara called Cordelia at midday. Cordelia was sitting at Croft's conference table when the call came in. She put it on speaker without asking permission, because Croft was already leaning forward in his chair, with both hands flat on the table. Ilara read both messages aloud. The conference room was completely silent when she finished. Croft stood up slowly, the way tall buildings rise with absolute certainty about their own weight. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to the room. "We refiled today," he said. The refiled complaint landed in federal court that afternoon. The full case rebuilt and expanded. All the victims, all the incidents, the complete shell company network, the property acquisition timeline, the warrant processing communications, and Ilara's recovered messages connecting Pruitt to Langford's department in language so direct, it left no room for interpretation. The new presiding judge was the Honorable Vera Martin, appointed years ago. No political debts that anyone had been able to find, because nobody had tried to put any there. She had a civil rights record that Croft knew cold. He had appeared before her before and won. And what he remembered most was that she read everything herself and asked questions that proved it. Judge Martin read the refiled complaint that evening. She scheduled the hearing for days out. The investigative piece published the next morning early. Dozens of pages, multiple sources, months of documented incidents, all laid out with the methodical clarity of reporters who had spent time doing exactly what Cordelia had pointed them toward. The piece named names. It showed the shell company structures with diagrams. It mapped the property corridors. It put the Magnolia Grove wedding raid in the center of the story, the moment the pattern became visible, but made clear it was one entry in a long, deliberate ledger. Quickly, it was the most read article on the outlet's website. By mid-morning, national networks had picked it up. By noon, millions of people had read it. Voss's lawyers stopped returning Croft's calls by midday. Langford did not leave his office all day. His press secretary issued a statement describing the investigation as politically motivated. Nobody ran it. Cordelia read the piece at her kitchen table that morning, all of it beginning to end without stopping. When she finished, she closed the laptop and sat quietly for a moment. Quentin came in and looked at her face. "Is it good?" he asked. Cordelia looked up at him. "It's everything," she said. Days later, Cordelia walked into federal court for the second time. The difference was immediate and physical. The first hearing had been packed. This one was something else entirely. Every seat in the gallery was filled early. People were standing along the back wall. Sketch artists sat in the second row because cameras were not permitted and the networks wanted something to show. The congressional staffers were back, more of them this time, and one of them Cordelia recognized as a senior counsel for the House Judiciary Committee. She walked to the plaintiff's table and sat down and did not look at the gallery. Ryder was there again. Same dark suit. Same crossed arms, but something had changed in his face since the last hearing. The contempt was still there, but underneath it now was something tighter. Something that looked, if you knew what to look for, like a man who had started doing the math and did not like the answer. Voss's attorneys were at the defense table. The bankers' boxes were gone. In their place were slim folders and expressions that had been carefully arranged to project confidence. Cordelia had been in enough courtrooms to know the difference between confidence and its performance. Judge Vera Martin took the bench on time. Croft was on his feet within minutes. He began with the families, not with the legal framework or the statutory citations. Those would come, but with the people. Lena's table, Greater Emmanuel Baptist, the hardware store, the health clinic. He described what had happened to each of them in plain, specific language, the kind that did not require a law degree to understand. The dining room cleared mid-lunch. The congregation searched between services. The deacon taken away in an ambulance. He named every business owner, every family, every loss. The courtroom was completely still. Then he built the architecture, the shell companies, the financial trails, the property corridors, the recovered messages between Pruitt and Langford's department. He laid it all out with the patience of a man who had been doing this for decades and understood that the most powerful thing a lawyer could do in a courtroom was make the truth impossible to look away from. Judge Martin listened to every word. When Croft finished the opening presentation, she turned to the defense table and asked Voss's lead attorney to explain the structural similarities between the shell companies. The attorney began a prepared answer about standard corporate filing practices. Martin cut him off in the third sentence. "Counselor," she said, "I've read the filings. I'm asking you to explain the similarities, not describe standard practice." The attorney regrouped and tried again. Martin listened, asked 2 more questions, and moved on. Ryder was called to testify later. He walked to the stand the same way he walked everywhere, like he owned the floor under his feet. Croft let him settle. Let him answer the first questions with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had been rehearsed carefully by people who charged high hourly rates. Then Croft produced the warrant processing timeline. He walked Ryder through it minute by minute. Who requested the expedited approval? Who processed it? Who signed off? Ryder's answers grew shorter, more careful. Croft kept walking forward, and Ryder kept stepping back until he reached the wall and said the thing that finished him. "I was following orders," Ryder said. "The warrant came through proper channels. I executed the search as directed. That's all." The courtroom absorbed this in silence. Someone in the gallery made a sound. Not a word. Just an exhale of recognition that moved through the room like a wave. Judge Martin's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened by a degree. Just following orders. In a civil rights case. In a federal courtroom. Croft did not react to it visibly. He simply marked it in his notes and moved on because he did not need to underline it. Everyone in the room had already done that themselves. Voss took the stand in the afternoon. He was dressed perfectly. Silver-haired, straight-backed, projecting the particular authority of a man who had spent decades being told he was important. His attorneys had prepared him carefully. He began well, measured, precise. Every answer shaped to acknowledge nothing. Croft let him talk. He waited until Voss had established his rhythm, found his comfort, started to believe the room was manageable. Then Croft placed the recovered messages on the podium and began. He asked about Pruitt. Voss said he recalled general conversations. He asked about the corridor properties. Voss said he had many investments. He asked about the timing of the Magnolia Grove tip. Voss said he had no knowledge of any tip. Croft asked the same question several different ways across many minutes. Each time the answer came back, "I don't recall." Then Croft placed a specific message on the screen. Pruitt's text, the one that said, "The Hayes situation needs to be addressed," and asked Voss directly whether he had instructed Pruitt to contact Langford's department regarding Cordelia Hayes. Voss looked at his attorneys. He looked at the message. He said, "I don't recall that conversation." The courtroom went very quiet. Judge Martin leaned forward. "Mr. Voss," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "I want to remind you that you are under oath." Harlan Voss sat in the witness chair and said nothing. The room held its breath. Days after the hearing, Croft called in the morning. Quentin was in the kitchen when Cordelia's phone rang. He watched her face as she answered, the stillness of it, the way she held herself when something important was happening. He had learned to read her over the years, the way you learn to read weather, the small signals, the things she did not know she was showing. He saw the moment it changed. It started around her eyes. Something released there, some tension that had been living in the corners of them for so long. He had almost forgotten it was not permanent. Then her jaw loosened. Then she exhaled, slow and deep, the way a person exhales when they have been holding something very heavy and someone has finally said they can put it down. She looked at him across the kitchen. She nodded once. Quentin sat down in the nearest chair. Judge Vera Martin had taken days, and she had used every hour of them. The ruling was dozens of pages long. Croft read the operative sections to Cordelia over the phone in the careful, precise voice he used when the words mattered too much to rush. Chief Victor Langford, liable. Civil rights violations under Section 1983, racially discriminatory use of police power, retaliatory conduct against a federal officer of the court. The ruling was direct and unsparing. Martin had not softened a single finding. Langford was ordered to pay substantial damages. The ruling further recommended his conduct be referred to the Georgia Attorney General's office for review of potential criminal exposure. Croft had barely finished the sentence before Cordelia's phone lit up with a news alert. Langford had submitted his resignation to the mayor's office that morning, effective immediately. His statement was short and contained no apology. By afternoon, the mayor had accepted it in a press release that was longer and contained considerably more regret. Most of it what? Cordelia suspected about the timing. Victor Langford would never hold public office again. Lieutenant Kane Ryder, terminated, effective the date of the ruling. His law enforcement certification referred to the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council for review and likely revocation. A separate criminal referral filed with the Fulton County District Attorney's Office for filing false incident reports and making material misrepresentations in a sworn warrant application. Croft read this section and then paused. "He's done," Croft said simply. "Professionally and likely criminally. His attorney called my office earlier asking about a cooperation agreement." Cordelia said nothing for a moment. "Tell them to call the DA," she said. "Harlan Voss." This section took longer to read. Civil damages of millions to Cordelia and Quentin for violation of civil rights, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and conspiracy to weaponize law enforcement for private financial gain. Additional millions to be distributed among the other victims of the shell company scheme, allocated proportionally based on documented losses. A DOJ criminal referral for conspiracy to violate civil rights, wire fraud across state lines, and obstruction of justice. An immediate freeze pending full federal investigation on all of Voss's active development permits across multiple Atlanta neighborhoods. His real estate holding companies named as subjects of a continuing federal inquiry. Croft finished reading and let the silence sit for a moment. His attorneys called this morning too, Croft said. Before the ruling was even public. What did they want? To talk about settlement. Tell them we already have one, Cordelia said. There was one more thing. Cordelia had asked Croft for it days earlier before the ruling, when they were reviewing the final filings. He had looked at her when she asked, and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Of course." At the public reading of the ruling that afternoon, before the gallery and the cameras and the congressional staffers and the journalists who had covered every hour of this story, Julian Croft stood at the plaintiff's table and read the names into the federal court record. Lena's table. Greater Emmanuel Baptist, the hardware store, the health clinic, all the families, all the businesses, every single one read aloud, slowly and clearly, so that each name landed and settled and became part of the permanent record of what had been done and what it had cost. The gallery was completely silent throughout. That evening, Cordelia and Quentin sat on the back porch in the dark. No phones, no television, no legal pads. Just the Georgia night, and the sound of the neighborhood settling into itself, and the warmth of two people sitting close after a very long time in the cold. Quentin took her hand. Neither of them spoke for a while. The stars were out. Cordelia looked up at them and thought about her father in his Sunday suit, and the sidewalk, and the promise he had made her when she was a little girl. "One day, baby, you will." She squeezed Quentin's hand. "Let's get married," she said. Quentin turned to look at her. Then he smiled wide and slow and completely unguarded. The smile of a man who had been waiting a long time to hear exactly those words. "Yeah," he said. "Let's." Weeks later, on a Saturday morning, Cordelia Hayes stood in front of a mirror again. Same bridal suite, same ivory silk gown, cleaned and pressed and hanging without a single trace of what it had been through. Same pearl earrings, a new veil, slightly longer than the first one, with delicate embroidered edges, that caught the light when she moved. The venue owners had refused every dollar of the settlement money. Instead, they had spent their own, quietly, and without announcement, making Magnolia Grove more beautiful than it had ever been. New flower arrangements on every post, fresh paint on the garden gate. The flagstones where the wedding cake had shattered were gone, replaced with smooth, pale stone that looked like it had always been there. Some things you did not patch. You replaced them with something better. Vivian stood behind Cordelia, with both hands raised, working the veil into place with the focused precision of a woman who had been waiting weeks to do exactly this. She was wearing the same bridesmaid dress. She had ironed it herself early that morning. Cordelia had heard her doing it from upstairs and had not said a word. The bridesmaids were all there, every one of them. The federal prosecutor was already crying and trying to hide it behind her champagne glass. The congresswoman was giving a running commentary on the flower arrangements that nobody had asked for and everyone was grateful for. The Supreme Court clerk was laughing at something on her phone and then showing it to the prosecutor, which made the crying worse. Cordelia watched them in the mirror and felt something so full and complete she did not have a word for it. "Hold still," Vivian said. "I'm not moving." "You're breathing too loud." Cordelia laughed. Vivian stepped around to face her. She held Cordelia by both shoulders, the same way she had weeks ago, looking at every version of her at once, the way only a person who had been there for all of them could. Her eyes were bright. Her jaw was set in the particular way it got when she was refusing to cry in front of people. She was absolutely going to cry in front of people. "Mama would have loved this dress," she said. Same words as last time. "You said that last time," Cordelia told her. It was true last time. Vivian straightened the veil one final millimeter. "It's still true." She stepped back and looked at her sister. Really looked. And then she said something she had not said weeks ago. "Daddy would have loved today," she said quietly. The room got very still. Cordelia held her sister's gaze. She thought about a Sunday morning, and a blue suit, and a sidewalk, and a promise made at the edge of a little girl's bed. She thought about years on the federal bench, and everything it had cost to get there, and everything it had cost to step away from it and fight in the open where anyone could see her. She thought about the families whose names were now part of the permanent federal record. She smiled, not the composed, careful smile she kept ready for courtrooms and cameras. The real one. The wide-open, completely unguarded smile of a woman who had been told she would win and had never stopped believing it. "He knew I would," she said. Outside, the string quartet began. Guests had come back. Every single one. Plus more who had called the venue coordinator and asked carefully and hopefully whether there might be room. There was room. There was always going to be room for people who showed up. Quentin stood at the altar. His eyes found the door of the bridal suite before Cordelia even appeared, the way they always did, like he had a compass that only pointed one direction. His groomsmen flanked him, the same men who had been forced face down on the grass in their tuxedos weeks ago. They stood straighter today, shoulders back, chins up, the particular pride of men who had been pushed down and chosen to rise, and knew the difference between the two. Cordelia stepped out of the suite. The garden went quiet in that way gardens do when something true is happening in them. She walked the same distance, the same Georgia light coming down warm and golden through the magnolia trees, the same white roses on the aisle posts, the same music lifting up into the air. No sirens came up the drive. No gates burst open. Nobody put their hands on anyone. She reached Quentin, and he took her hands in both of his, and his eyes were full, and she did not look away from them for a single second. The ceremony was simple and perfect, and entirely theirs. At the reception, Cordelia stood to speak. The room went quiet immediately, the instinctive quiet of people who understood they were about to hear something worth hearing. She thanked her guests. She thanked Quentin, who looked at her from his chair like she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. She thanked Vivian, who was already dabbing her eyes with a cocktail napkin. She thanked Silas, Croft, Ilara. She said their names clearly and let each one land. Then she paused. "My father told me something when I was a little girl," she said. "He said one day I would win." She looked out at the faces in front of her, all of them, everyone. I spent a long time thinking winning meant the title, the robe, the gavel, the institutional protection of a system that was supposed to work for everyone. She shook her head slowly. But the real win, the one that lasts, isn't the power they give you. It's the justice you fight for when they take it away. The room was absolutely still. Cordelia raised her glass. "To everybody who ever got knocked down in their best clothes," her voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the garden. "Get back up. Your day is coming." Everyone rose to their feet. Silas made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob that was entirely his sister's victory and entirely his own pride, and entirely the sound of a promise made long ago on the edge of a little girl's bed. Finally, and completely, kept. The Georgia night came down warm around all of them. Nobody left early. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you don't miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.